My family thinks my $65,000 salary is a joke, especially since they were just invited to a NATO summit as financial experts. For 12 years, I've swallowed their pity and their condescending remarks, letting them believe I was a failure. But they have no idea that the only reason I'm at that same summit is because I'm the one person who can stop a global economic collapse, and it's about to happen right in front of them. Before I tell you how it all went down, let me know where you're listening from in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how far these stories travel. And if you love stories about getting the last word, make sure you hit that subscribe button because you won't want to miss this. The Vance family dinner table was less a place for connection and more a corporate boardroom where my value was perpetually under review. The air, thick with the scent of my mother's expensive perfume and roasted lamb, always felt heavy with unspoken judgments. The clinking of heavy silverware on porcelain was the only sound for a long moment, a familiar rhythm in the symphony of our dysfunction. My father, Harrison Vance, swirled the deep red wine in his glass, the crystal catching the light from the chandelier above. He had the kind of easy confidence that comes from a lifetime of multi-million-dollar decisions. He was recounting a leveraged buyout he'd advised on his voice, booming with the authority of a man used to being the smartest person in any room. My brother Marcus, ever the prodigy from Wharton, jumped in not to support our father, but to subtly one-up him. His hedge fund had just shorted a volatile tech stock at the perfect moment. "We just cleared a nine-figure profit for our investors this quarter," he announced, leaning back in his chair with a smirk. "The market is a battlefield and we're winning the war." I listened, nodding at the appropriate times, feeling more like an anthropologist studying a foreign tribe than a member of my own family. Then, as it always did, the conversation pivoted to me. The silence that fell was heavy with expectation, or more accurately, a lack of it. "How's the data thing going, Evelyn?" My mother asked, her tone laced with a delicate, almost surgical pity. "It's going well," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "We're working on some new predictive models." "Predictive models." Marcus chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. He took a deliberate sip of his wine. "Sounds thrilling." He set the glass down. "Are they paying you well for all that?" Excitement. 65, right? He said the number not as a question, but as an indictment. "That's pocket change, Ev. My bonus last year." "God, I don't think I could live on your entire annual salary for a month." The words landed like stones in the quiet dining room. I felt the familiar heat rise in my cheeks, a phantom burn from a wound that never fully healed. I didn't defend myself. What was the point? Arguing would only make me look defensive and petty. My silence, I had learned long ago, was my only shield. I just took a sip of water, my mind momentarily flashing to the classified budget I had authorized that morning, a figure with enough zeros to make Marcus's bonus look like an accounting error. But all I could do was sit there, the family's quiet disappointment, the low-level analyst. My father just nodded sagely, as if Marcus had made a profound point. "Well," he said, not unkindly, but with a finality that cut deeper than any insult, "not everyone is built for the front lines of finance." I looked around the table at the faces of my family, the people who were supposed to know me best. To them, I was a rounding error in their ledger of success, a fixed asset with no growth potential. And in that moment, all I could do was hold on to the truth they could never comprehend a secret worth more than all their fortunes combined. That hollow feeling in my chest was not new. It was a familiar ghost, and Marcus's jab about my salary had summoned it instantly. It dragged my memory back 3 years to a Thanksgiving that felt less like a holiday and more like a public audit of my life choices. The whole extended Vance clan was there. Aunts, uncles, and cousins filled my parents' home with loud laughter and the warm scent of cinnamon and cloves. Everyone was gathered in the living room after the feast, sipping brandy and telling stories of their year's successes. My cousin had just closed a major real estate deal. My uncle had been featured in a trade magazine. The air was thick with achievement. My father, beaming, proposed a toast to the family's continued prosperity. As glasses were raised, Marcus, ever the showman, decided it was his turn to hold court. He stood by the fireplace swirling his brandy, a smug smile playing on his lips. He started by congratulating everyone, a politician warming up the crowd before the main event. Then his eyes landed on me sitting quietly on the ottoman. "And we can't forget Evelyn," he said, his voice carrying across the room, silencing other conversations. "She got her end-of-year bonus too." A few relatives smiled politely in my direction. I felt a knot form in my stomach. I knew this was not a genuine compliment. It was a setup. He took a dramatic pause. "My fund just cleared our final numbers. My personal bonus this year is $1.2 million. A wave of impressed murmurs went through the room. He let the number hang in the air for a moment before turning his full attention back to me. "So, Evelyn, tell everyone what your big bonus was. I'm sure it was significant." The word significant was dripping with sarcasm. The room was silent. Every eye was on me. I felt myself shrinking, the roaring fire suddenly feeling cold. I remember looking at my father hoping he would intervene, but he just had a slight proud smile on his face, amused by his son's bravado. My mother was suddenly very interested in straightening a picture frame on the mantelpiece. No one was coming to save me. I finally found my voice a small, quiet thing. $5,000. Marcus let out a short, sharp laugh as if I just told the funniest joke he'd ever heard. 5,000, he repeated, savoring the sound of it. "Well, that's a start, I suppose. It's good to have goals." He turned away, then his point made, and the conversation slowly started up again. But I could feel the change in the air. I could see the pitying glances from my aunts, the quick, dismissive looks from my uncles. In 30 seconds, Marcus had publicly defined my worth to the entire family. That moment was seared into my memory. It was not just an insult. It was a brand, a label of mediocrity that they had all accepted as fact. And it was a scar I carried into every family gathering that followed a constant aching reminder of the box they had put me in. A week later, the collision I had spent my entire career avoiding was set into motion by two pieces of communication. One was a gilded invitation. The other was a classified directive. The invitation arrived at my parents' house, printed on heavy cream cardstock, with the official NATO crest embossed in gold. My mother called me, her voice buzzing with a level of excitement I hadn't heard in years. "Evelyn, you won't believe it. Your father and Marcus have been invited to the Economic Security Summit in Brussels as civilian consultants. Can you imagine? It's such an honor, a testament to the Vance name." I could picture her perfectly holding the invitation like a trophy. To her, this was the ultimate validation. It confirmed their status at the pinnacle of the financial world, a world where she believed I had no place. I offered my congratulations, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. She went on about the dignitaries they would meet, the galas they would attend, and how proud she was that the family's legacy was being recognized on a global stage. A few hours later, my own notification arrived. It wasn't delivered by mail, but through a secure channel on my encrypted terminal. It was a single line of text from General Peterson's office. "Directive 74 Alpha. You are to embed with the U.S. delegation to the Brussels Summit. Cover designation Junior Analyst State Department Liaison. Eyes and ears only unless directed otherwise." My heart sank. For 12 years, I had maintained a firewall between my two lives with meticulous precision. I had missed weddings, birthdays, and holidays, all to avoid situations exactly like this one. Now, a summit in Brussels was about to become the smallest, most crowded room in the world. I would be there in the same building as my family, forced to play the part of the insignificant aide while they basked in the spotlight. This was not a coincidence. I knew the real reason for my assignment. Tensions with the Eastern Coalition had been escalating for months. Their financial warfare tactics were growing bolder. The summit was not just a diplomatic meeting, it was a potential battlefield, and my presence was a precautionary measure, a weapon being placed on the board before the game even began. I couldn't refuse. A directive was not a request. That night, I packed a small suitcase, the contents a perfect metaphor for my life. On one side, a simple off-the-rack business suit, the kind a junior analyst would wear. On the other, tucked into a hidden compartment, was a set of secure communication devices and a hard drive containing the classified threat assessments for every NATO member's financial infrastructure. The stage was set. In Brussels, the Vance family would arrive expecting to be honored for their financial acumen. They would be ready to offer their opinions to network to solidify their legacy, and I would be there in the background, the quiet, overlooked daughter. But I wouldn't be there to analyze data. I would be there to watch for the first signs of a war they didn't even know was coming. The ultimate confrontation wasn't just possible anymore. It was inevitable. The air in Brussels was crisp and carried the faint sweet scent of waffles from a street vendor nearby. It was a city steeped in history and power, but for me, it just felt like a pressure cooker. We all stayed at the same five-star hotel, a grand old building with marble columns and sweeping staircases. My room was a standard single on the third floor. My family, of course, was in the presidential suite. I managed to avoid them for the first day using preliminary security briefings as my excuse. But on the morning before the summit's opening ceremony, our paths finally crossed in the hotel lobby. They were descending the main staircase as I was heading towards the conference wing. My father was in a tailored Savile Row suit, looking every bit the elder statesman of finance. Marcus was beside him, radiating an almost blinding aura of self-satisfaction. My mother was flawless in a Chanel suit, her expression a careful mix of pride and aristocratic grace. They saw me. For a moment, I saw a flicker of surprise on their faces, as if they couldn't quite place why their underachieving daughter would be in a place like this. Evelyn. My mother said, her voice smooth but cool. What a surprise. I didn't realize your company sent junior staff on these trips. I'm here to take notes for my department, I replied, the lie feeling practiced and thin. Marcus looked me up and down, his gaze lingering for a moment on my simple functional attire. It was a look I knew well. It was a silent appraisal that had already found me wanting. He didn't say a word, which was somehow more insulting than his usual jabs. My father reached into his wallet and pulled out a few crisp €100 notes. He pressed them into my hand, his fingers briefly brushing mine. The gesture was meant to be kind, paternal, but it felt like the ultimate act of condescension. Here he said, his voice low and confidential, as if sharing a secret. Go buy yourself something nice while you're here. A new dress, perhaps. I know your salary doesn't leave much room for luxuries. I looked down at the money in my palm. It wasn't about the amount. It was about what it represented. 12 years of secret, dangerous work for my country, 12 years of sacrificing personal connections and accolades into my own father. I was still just a charity case, a daughter so incapable that she needed a handout to buy a decent outfit. The burn of humiliation was immediate and intense. It was a deeper cut than any insult Marcus had ever thrown at me. This was not born of malice. This was born of pity, a genuine belief in my failure that was so absolute it manifested as this small, misguided act of generosity. It was the final drop of poison in a cup that had been filling for over a decade. Thank you, I said, my voice barely a whisper. I folded the bills and put them in my pocket. I have to get to a briefing. I walked away without looking back, the starched collar of my shirt suddenly feeling tight around my neck. The weight of the euros in my pocket felt heavier than any piece of tactical gear I had ever carried. As I walked through the opulent hotel lobby, past ambassadors and industrialists, I had never felt more invisible. I was a ghost in my own family's story, a footnote in the grand narrative of their success. But I knew a storm was coming, and when it hit, they would be forced to see me for who I really was. The pre-summit reception was held in a magnificent ballroom, with soaring frescoed ceilings and crystal chandeliers that dripped light onto the powerful people below. The room buzzed with a dozen languages, a low hum of global influence. I did my job staying on the periphery, observing the delegates, and making myself as inconspicuous as possible. My official role was to be a wallflower, and I played the part perfectly. From across the room, I could see my family holding court. They were in their element, effortlessly mingling with finance ministers and banking magnates. Marcus, with a champagne flute in hand, was particularly animated, telling a story that had a small circle of dignitaries laughing. At one point, I saw him spot me standing near a service entrance. He gave me a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head, a gesture that clearly said, "Don't embarrass us." Later, as I was fetching a glass of water, I found myself near his group. He was speaking with the French Minister of Finance. a man whose portfolio I had studied for months. Marcus, seeing his opportunity, placed a hand on the minister's arm and gestured towards me with a patronizing smile. "And Minister, this is my younger sister, Evelyn. She's also in finance," he said, drawing out the word also as if it were a great concession. The minister, a polite older gentleman, turned and gave me a pleasant nod. "A pleasure," Marcus continued, his voice dripping with false modesty. "She's on a different track than us, of course, more of a support role, analyzing data for one of the smaller firms. But we're proud of her for finding her niche." It was the final insult delivered with a smile on the world stage. He wasn't just defining me as lesser to our family anymore. He was defining me as lesser to the world, to the very people whose economic security was in reality my responsibility. He was painting me as a harmless, slightly dim-witted younger sister who dabbled in numbers. The minister gave me another polite, but now slightly dismissive smile, and turned his attention back to Marcus, the real financial player. I just stood there for a moment, the glass of water cold in my hand. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel sadness. I felt a profound sense of calm. It was the calm that comes when you know a final line has been crossed. The quiet focus of a soldier in the moments before the battle begins. I simply nodded to the group and walked away, retreating to my post in the shadows. The performance was over. The condescension had reached its peak, and the silence that would follow, I knew would be deafening. The summit's main session began the next morning in the NATO Central Auditorium. It was a cavernous, state-of-the-art chamber, with a massive digital screen spanning the entire wall behind the main dais. I sat in the designated staff section at the very back, a notebook and pen in my hand, playing the part of a diligent aide. My family was seated in the front rows with the other civilian consultants, looking important and exuding confidence. The first hour was a predictable series of speeches about economic cooperation and transatlantic solidarity. The German chancellor was mid-sentence discussing trade policy when it happened. It started not with a bang, but with a flicker. A brief, almost imperceptible glitch on the main screen. Then another. The scrolling ticker at the bottom of the screen displaying live data from the world's major stock exchanges suddenly froze. Then it began to cascade. London, Frankfurt, Tokyo, New York. Red arrows appeared next to every major index, pointing sharply down. A nervous murmur rippled through the auditorium. On the dais, the chancellor faltered, looking at her aides in confusion. Before anyone could speak, a piercing electronic tone echoed through the chamber's sound system. It wasn't a fire alarm. It was a network alert, a sound I knew with chilling intimacy. Every screen in the room, from the massive main display to the small tablets on each delegate's desk, simultaneously went black. A single line of text appeared in stark white letters. "Your system is now ours. The Gilded Serpent sends its regards." Panic erupted. Shouts echoed across the room. Security personnel rushed towards the stage, speaking urgently into their wrists. The feed was immediately cut, but it was too late. The message had been delivered. This wasn't just a hack. It was a declaration of war. My training kicked in instantly. The noise, the confusion, the rising tide of fear in the room, it all faded into the background. My focus narrowed to a single point. I discreetly pulled out my secure communications device, a phone that looked mundane but was anything but. A single encrypted message was already waiting for me from General Peterson's command center. Code red. Gilded Serpent is live. Hostile takeover of Swift network in progress. You are cleared for active countermeasures. My blood ran cold. This wasn't a simulation anymore. This was the real thing. The scenario we had wargamed just a week ago was now unfolding on the global stage. I looked across the chaotic auditorium to the front row. I could see my father and brother huddled together, their faces a mask of confusion and dawning horror. They were witnessing the type of financial catastrophe they had only ever read about in textbooks. The room was transforming. What had been a diplomatic conference just minutes before was now the forward operating base in a new kind of world war. And in that room full of the world's most powerful people, surrounded by experts and leaders, I knew a terrifying truth. I was the only one there who knew how to fight back. In the chaos, order began to reassert itself. But it was the cold, hard order of a crisis, not the polite decorum of a summit. Security personnel formed a perimeter, locking down the auditorium. No one was getting in or out. The civilian consultants, who had been treated like royalty moments before, were now just part of the lockdown, their expensive suits looking flimsy in the harsh glare of the emergency lighting. The polite facade of global cooperation had shattered, replaced by the raw urgency of a command center under siege. The NATO Secretary General, a stern man with a military background, took the main podium. His voice, amplified by the emergency system, cut through the panic. "Everyone be seated. The situation is under control. We need a clear and immediate assessment." He scanned the front rows, his eyes landing on the people his staff had identified as the titans of finance. "Mr. Harrison Vance," his voice boomed. "You and your son were invited for your expertise. Your insights right now would be invaluable." A spotlight, both literal and metaphorical, swung onto my father. He stood squaring his shoulders, a lifetime of boardroom confidence automatically kicking in. But I could see the subtle signs of strain, the slight tremor in his hand as he adjusted his tie. His usual booming voice was a fraction quieter, less certain. "We need to reassure the markets," he began, his words sounding like a pre-written script from a bygone era. "A coordinated statement from the central banks is required to prevent a panic sell-off." He was talking about treating a symptom, not the disease. It was like advising a patient with a bullet wound to take an aspirin. The Secretary General looked unimpressed. "And how do you propose we do that when our entire communications network is compromised?" "Mr. Vance, my father had no answer." He stood there, speechless. The great financial oracle suddenly mute. The Secretary General's gaze shifted to Marcus, who stepped forward eagerly as if this was his moment to outshine our father. "This appears to be a coordinated algorithmic attack designed to trigger market circuit breakers," Marcus said, the jargon tumbling out of him. "The key is to halt trading across all platforms to contain the—" He trailed off his own words, sounding hollow as he looked at the dead frozen screens. He was talking about the market's internal defenses, but this attack hadn't come from inside the market. It was an external hostile act of war. The circuit breakers were irrelevant. He was a master of a game that was no longer being played. He looked from the screen to the Secretary General, and for the first time since I had known him, my brother's face was a blank mask of utter confusion. He had no more answers. I watched this display of high-level incompetence with a kind of clinical calm. They were generals trying to fight a cyber war with cavalry charges. They were using hammers to fix a watch. They were brilliant in their own world, but that world had just ceased to exist. The men who had built their identities on having all the answers, the men who had judged me for my perceived failures, were now publicly, irrevocably powerless. The room was silent, waiting for someone, anyone, who actually knew what to do. A thick, suffocating silence settled over the auditorium. The collective hope that had briefly rested on my father and brother evaporated, leaving a vacuum of fear and uncertainty. They stood there, exposed and inadequate, the titans of Wall Street reduced to clueless spectators at a catastrophe they couldn't comprehend. The world's most powerful leaders looked around the room, their faces grim, searching for an answer that wasn't there. The machine had broken, and none of the master mechanics knew how to fix it. It was in that moment of absolute paralysis that a new presence made itself known. From the front row of the military delegation, a man stood up. He was an American four-star general, his uniform crisp and adorned with decorations that spoke of a lifetime of service in unseen conflicts. He was tall, imposing, and moved with an economy of motion that radiated absolute command. He didn't ask for permission to speak. He simply took control. He turned to the NATO Secretary General, his voice not loud, but carrying a steel edge that cut through the silence like a razor. "Mr. Secretary," he said, his tone respectful but firm, "with all due respect to your civilian consultants, their expertise is irrelevant here. They are trying to put out a digital inferno with paper cups of water. You are not dealing with a market correction. You are dealing with a coordinated military strike on our global economic infrastructure." He let that sink in for a beat. The word military strike changed everything. This was no longer a financial problem. It was a national security crisis. The general continued, his gaze sweeping across the room full of politicians and bankers. There are only a handful of people on this planet who have the training, the authority, and the access to the necessary countermeasures to even attempt to stop this. And as luck would have it, the foremost expert in this specific type of asymmetric warfare is in this room with us today. A ripple of anticipation went through the crowd. Heads turned searching for this hidden savior. The general's eyes scanned the rows passing over the finance ministers, the ambassadors, and the decorated military attachés. He looked past my father and brother, his expression unreadable. His gaze traveled all the way to the back of the room to the staff section, where I sat in my simple business suit. His eyes locked onto mine. He raised his voice slightly, a clear, direct command that echoed through the silent chamber. The person who has the power to shut this down is not a banker or a politician. The person you need right now is Colonel Vance. The general's words dropped into the cavernous hall like a depth charge, the resulting shockwave rippling outwards in stunned silence. Colonel Vance. The name hung in the air, an impossible paradox. Every head in the room swiveled following the general's gaze, a sea of confused faces tracing a line from the main stage all the way to the insignificant staff section in the back. Their eyes passed over me, then scanned the rows, then darted back, unable to process what they were seeing. I felt the weight of 1,000 stares, but there was no fear, no hesitation. This was the moment my entire professional life had been built for. This was the scenario I had rehearsed in my mind 100 times. The anonymity I had worn like a cloak for 12 years simply fell away. I stood up. The general, seeing he had my attention, didn't wait for a response. He issued a direct order, his voice resonating with the absolute authority of command. "Colonel, give us protocol lockdown. Now." I didn't speak. I didn't nod. I simply began to move. I walked down the aisle, my footsteps echoing in the profound silence. The crowd parted for me as if I were a ghost, their faces a mixture of disbelief and awe. I could feel my family's eyes on me burning into my back. I didn't look at them. My mission was singular. I reached the front of the auditorium and walked directly to a secure communications terminal near the main dais, a piece of equipment that had gone unnoticed by everyone else. It was connected directly to the backbone of NATO's encrypted network. I placed my palm on the biometric scanner. It glowed green. Access granted. Colonel E. Vance. On the screen, a command line interface appeared. My fingers flew across the keyboard, a blur of motion. I wasn't thinking. I was acting muscle memory and years of training taking over. I typed a complex alphanumeric sequence, a digital key that only a handful of people in the world possessed. It was the master override for the system our enemies had hijacked. On the massive screens above, which still displayed the enemy's taunting message, my command line appeared superimposed over their text. I hit enter. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then the enemy's message flickered and vanished. The cascading red numbers, the symbols of global panic, all disappeared. The screens went a calm, neutral blue. Then a new line of text appeared in a simple green block font. Network assets frozen. Counter trace initiated. It was over. In less than 60 seconds, I had single-handedly halted a catastrophic global economic attack. I had slammed the door shut, locked it, and was now actively hunting the people who had tried to break it down. I took a step back from the terminal, my work done. The silence in the room was no longer one of fear. It was one of pure, unadulterated shock. The spell of silence was finally broken by the 4-star general. He walked to the center of the dais, his presence effortlessly commanding the room's full attention. He addressed the stunned delegates, his voice calm and steady, a reassuring anchor in the sea of confusion. "Ladies and gentlemen, the immediate threat has been neutralized by Colonel Vance. The situation is now contained." He then turned his body slightly, a deliberate and calculated movement to face my father and brother. Though he was addressing the entire room, his words were clearly aimed at them. He was not just providing information, he was delivering a verdict. For the benefit of our civilian consultants, he began, his voice carrying a new, harder edge. "Let me provide some context that might have been missing from your market analyses. For the past 3 years, the relative stability and predictable growth that the Western markets have enjoyed have not been a result of market forces alone. That stability was a carefully constructed shield, maintained by a series of proactive clandestine operations, designed to counter threats like the one you just witnessed. He paused, letting the weight of his statement settle. I saw my brother Marcus flinch as if he had been physically struck. Those operations the general continued, his eyes fixed on my father, have been planned, coordinated, and commanded by the United States Air Force's Economic Warfare Division, a division led by Colonel Evelyn Vance. The room was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of revelation, of dots being connected. The general wasn't finished. He took a step closer to the edge of the stage, his voice dropping slightly but losing none of its intensity, becoming a focused, devastating instrument. So let me be perfectly clear. The very prosperity that has allowed a fund like your son's to flourish, Mr. Vance, was in fact a direct result of the unseen tireless work of your daughter. The daughter whose $65,000 salary you find so inadequate. That salary is a cover, a necessary fiction for a woman who has the security clearance to access, and if necessary, to freeze assets equivalent to the entire gross domestic product of a small nation. He let the last sentence hang in the air, a final crushing truth. He had taken the private insults, the family's secret condescension, and held it up to the light for the entire world to see. He had not only revealed my success, he had used their own words, their own judgments to frame the sheer staggering scale of their ignorance. It was a verbal kill shot delivered with surgical precision. And in the ensuing silence, all I could see was the complete and utter demolition of my family's world. In the wake of the general's final statement, a quiet but efficient protocol took over the room. Security personnel began discreetly escorting the delegates out through secure exits. Staffers moved with hushed urgency. The crisis had been averted, and now the process of containing the information began. The auditorium, which had been the epicenter of global panic just minutes earlier, started to empty, leaving behind a strange echoing silence. Amid this orderly dispersal, my family remained in their seats, marooned in the front row, like survivors on a deserted island. The world was moving on around them, but their own personal world had come to a dead stop. No one approached them. No one spoke to them. It was as if they were surrounded by an invisible wall of shame, a barrier built from the rubble of their arrogance. I stood near the terminal, my work done, and simply watched them. The general had given me a slight respectful nod before he was whisked away by his aides for a high-level debrief. I was left alone in the same space as my family, but the distance between us felt wider than any ocean. My father sat hunched over his hands, clasped between his knees, staring at the floor. The titan of industry was gone, replaced by an old man grappling with a truth that had invalidated a lifetime of judgments. My mother was silently weeping, dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. Her carefully constructed world of social standing and family pride shattered into a million pieces. Marcus was a hollow shell. He stared blankly ahead, his eyes unfocused, replaying the last hour, the last decade in his mind. The smirk, the confidence, the condescension, it had all been stripped away, leaving nothing behind. I could have walked over. I could have offered a word of comfort or a word of anger or anything at all, but I didn't. There was nothing to say. The truth in all its brutal clarifying power had already said everything. My entire life, I had been the one on the outside of their circle, the quiet disappointment they tolerated. Now the roles were reversed. They were the ones isolated in their ignorance and regret, and I was the one standing in the center of a world they had never even known existed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a junior security officer, a young man who looked barely out of his teens, approached them. "Sir, ma'am," he said, his voice hesitant, "we need to clear the room." My father looked up at his eyes, meeting mine for a brief, fleeting moment across the empty auditorium. There was no anger in his gaze. There was no pride. There was only a profound, bottomless confusion, the look of a man who had just realized the map he'd been using his whole life was wrong. Then he looked away, nodded to the officer, and slowly, stiffly got to his feet. They followed the young man out, a silent, broken procession of three, leaving me alone in the vast, quiet room where everything had changed. That evening, I was in my hotel room writing my preliminary after-action report on a secure laptop. The adrenaline of the day had faded, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. There was a soft knock on my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. My security detail was posted at the end of the hall, and they wouldn't have let anyone through without my authorization. I checked the peephole. It was my father, alone. I hesitated for a moment, then unlatched the door. He stood in the hallway looking older and more frail than I had ever seen him. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie was loosened, and the confident spark in his eyes was gone, replaced by a deep, hollow uncertainty. "May I come in?" he asked. His voice, usually a booming instrument of authority, was quiet, almost tentative. I stepped aside and let him in. He walked to the center of the small room, looking out of place amidst the standard hotel furniture. He didn't sit down. He just stood there, his hands clasped behind his back, a man adrift. Why, he finally asked, the single word thick with a dozen unasked questions. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I closed the door and leaned against it, crossing my arms. It wasn't my story to tell Dad. It was my duty to keep it secret. That was the job. But from us, your own family, we treated you. He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "I know how you treated me," I said, my voice even devoid of accusation. I just stated it as a fact. The cover story was a requirement of the position. It had to be believable. Your disappointment, in a way, made it more secure. No one would ever suspect that the daughter of Harrison Vance, the one he was so obviously let down by, was involved in anything of importance. He flinched, the truth of my words hitting him like a physical blow. He finally turned from the window to face me. His eyes were filled with a confusing mix of shame, regret, and a dawning, reluctant respect. "The general said," he started, then stopped, trying to process the scale of it. "He said you command a division, at your age, to make colonel in a field like that. The things you must have done, the places you must have been." I didn't offer any details. The wall of classification between us was still there, and it always would be. All those times I had to cancel last minute or couldn't be reached for weeks, I said. I wasn't being irresponsible. I was deployed. He just shook his head slowly, a man trying to rewrite 12 years of history in his mind. "We thought you were lost. We thought you had no ambition. And all that time you were protecting us." "It wasn't just about protecting you," I said, my voice softening just a fraction. "It's about protecting the entire system we all depend on." "Your world, my world, they're more connected than you ever knew." He was silent for a long time after that, just looking at me, really looking at me, perhaps for the first time since I was a child. He was seeing not just his daughter, but a stranger in a familiar form, a woman who carried responsibilities he couldn't even fathom. The conversation wasn't an apology, not yet. It was something more fundamental. It was a reckoning, the first painful, necessary dialogue in the new world that had been created today. After he left my room, Harrison Vance didn't go back to the presidential suite. He went down to the hotel bar, a dark, quiet space paneled in rich mahogany, and ordered a scotch. Neat. He sat alone in a leather armchair in the corner, the amber liquid glowing in the low light. He didn't drink it. He just stared into the glass, watching the light play across its surface. For his entire life, Harrison had operated under a clear and simple set of rules. Value was measured in dollars. Success was measured in influence. Legacy was measured by the achievements of your children, achievements that had to be public, quantifiable, and impressive. He had built an empire on these principles. He had raised his children by them. Marcus was the perfect product of this philosophy, a living embodiment of every value Harrison held dear. And Evelyn had been the anomaly, the variable he couldn't solve, the investment that never paid off. He had written her off. It was a brutal truth, and it settled on him now with the crushing weight of a tombstone. He hadn't been cruel, not in his mind. He had simply been pragmatic. He had assessed her choices, her quiet demeanor, her lack of conventional ambition, and he had made a calculated decision. He had shifted his emotional and financial capital to the asset, with the higher potential for return his son. He thought back through the years, a slideshow of dismissals playing in his mind. The condescending comments at dinner, the pitying looks across the holiday table, the €100 notes he had pressed into her hand just yesterday, an act of charity for his broken, unsuccessful daughter. A hot wave of shame washed over him, so intense, it made him physically recoil. The general's words echoed in his head. Her salary is a cover. The prosperity of your son's fund was a direct result of her work. He had measured his daughter's worth with the wrong ruler. He had been looking at a chessboard, confident in his mastery of the game, while she had been playing three-dimensional chess on a galactic scale he never knew existed. His world of finance, which he had always seen as the center of the universe, was just one small fragile piece of a much larger, more dangerous puzzle. A puzzle his daughter was responsible for holding together. He had prided himself on his ability to see the whole picture, to assess risk, to understand the fundamental mechanics of power. And he had been blind, utterly, profoundly blind to the most important truth of all, the one living under his own roof. He finally picked up the glass, the scotch burning a trail down his throat. It wasn't a drink of pleasure or relaxation. It was penance. The first of many. The next morning, I was preparing to leave for a debriefing at the temporary command post when there was another knock on my door. This time it was Marcus. He looked even worse than our father had. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his usually impeccable hair was slightly disheveled. The arrogance that had been his defining characteristic was gone, replaced by a raw, nervous energy. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" he asked, his voice strained. I nodded and let him in. He paced the small room for a moment, unable to stand still, a predator suddenly trapped in a cage. He wouldn't look at me directly, his gaze darting from the window to the floor and back again. "I spent all night trying to run the numbers," he started, his voice barely above a whisper. "The risk models, the geopolitical factors, the sheer scale of the operational security required. It doesn't compute. What you do, it's a level of complexity I can't even begin to model." He finally stopped pacing and forced himself to look at me. His eyes were filled with a confusing mixture of awe and profound, gut-wrenching shame. "I've been an idiot," he said, the words coming out in a rush, as if he had been holding them in for so long they were physically painful. "No, not an idiot. An arrogant, condescending fool. For years I measured you against my own very small, very insignificant ruler. I thought I was on top of the world because I could make money, and I mocked you because you couldn't." He shook his head, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "The entire time I was playing checkers while you were— I don't even know what game you were playing. Something I didn't even know existed." He finally met my gaze, and I saw something I had never seen in him before. Vulnerability. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," he said, and the word sounded strange, foreign on his tongue. Not just for yesterday, for everything, for Thanksgiving, for every smug comment, every dismissive look. I was wrong, completely, fundamentally wrong. It wasn't a polished, eloquent apology. It was clumsy. It was raw. It was the awkward, painful confession of a man whose entire sense of self had been built on a foundation of lies. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. Not really. He was simply stating the truth as he now understood it. I just looked at him for a long moment. Then I gave a small, single nod. "Okay, Marcus," I said. It was all that needed to be said. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was an acknowledgement, a recognition of his painful newfound honesty. It was the first fragile stepping stone across the vast canyon that had separated us for our entire lives. 6 months later, I was back at my parents' house for dinner. The occasion was nothing special, just a Sunday evening, which in itself felt revolutionary. The grand, intimidating dining room that had once felt like a courtroom now just felt like a place to share a meal. The air was lighter. The silences were comfortable, not fraught with unspoken judgment. Everything had changed, and yet on the surface, everything looked the same. The shift in our family dynamic was not something we ever spoke about directly. It was demonstrated in 100 small, unspoken ways. My father now asked about my work, but he did so with a newfound respect for boundaries. He would say things like, "Anything interesting happening in your world this week that you can talk about?" The last four words were the key. They were an acknowledgement of the vast secret territory of my life that he would never have access to, and an acceptance of that fact. Marcus had undergone the most noticeable transformation. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost scholarly curiosity. He no longer talked about his own financial wins unless asked directly. Instead, he would ask me careful, intelligent questions about global economic trends or cybersecurity, treating me not as his clueless younger sister, but as a subject matter expert whose opinion he genuinely valued. He had started reading books on geopolitical strategy, trying in his own way to understand the world I inhabited. That evening, my mother brought out dessert, a simple apple pie. As she set it down, a news report flashed on the television in the adjoining living room. It was a brief mention of a foiled cyberattack on the Asian stock market, a minor event that barely made the headlines. The reporter said the attack was thwarted by an anonymous international task force. A year ago, Marcus would have made a cynical comment about government incompetence. My father would have launched into a lecture about market vulnerabilities. Tonight they just looked at me. They didn't ask if I was involved. They didn't ask for details. They just shared a look of quiet, profound understanding. In their eyes, I saw not just pride, but a deep, humbling respect for the battles I fought in secret. They were finally beginning to understand that the world was far more complex than their balance sheet suggested, and that my work was a critical, unseen part of the stability they had always taken for granted. The following week, I stood in a secure, soundproof room deep inside the Pentagon, preparing for my next assignment. It was a long-term, deep cover operation, one that would require me to be completely out of contact for months at a time. A new identity, a new city, a new set of carefully constructed lies. In many ways, nothing had changed. The work was still paramount. The secrecy was still absolute. But as I looked at the mission briefing on the screen, I felt a subtle internal shift. The familiar weight of my double life was still there, but it no longer felt like a solitary burden. The deep, aching loneliness that had been my constant companion for 12 years had receded. I was still unknown to the world, but I was no longer invisible to my family, and that had made all the difference. My secure phone buzzed with an incoming text from a cleared family channel we had established for essential communication. It was from my father. The text was simple, just 3 words: "Be safe, Colonel." It was everything. It was respect. It was understanding. It was a father's love finally expressed in a language that honored both of my worlds. It was the highest form of acknowledgement he could give me, a validation that resonated more deeply than any official commendation. I typed back a quick reply: "Always, Captain." I smiled, a genuine, unburdened smile. The vindication I had craved for so long hadn't come from the dramatic revelation in Brussels. That had been the catalyst, the explosion that cleared the ground. The true vindication had come in the quiet moments that followed. The clumsy apology from my brother, the respectful questions from my father, the quiet understanding around a dinner table. My real victory wasn't in proving them wrong. It was in creating a space where a new, more honest truth could begin to grow. I had finally been seen not for my salary or my superficial career choices, but for the substance of my character and the significance of my commitment. I had earned my place in my family, not by conforming to their standards, but by staying true to my own. As I turned my attention back to the mission briefing, I realized that true vindication is not about changing other people's minds. It's about having the strength to live your own truth quietly and consistently until the world has no choice but to catch up. The greatest power isn't in the noise you make, but in the silent, unwavering dedication to the mission you were chosen for. This whole experience taught me a powerful lesson. Your worth is not determined by the people who refuse to see it. It's forged in the quiet hours, in the difficult work you do when no one is watching. It's easy to feel invisible when your success doesn't fit the narrow definition that others have for it. But the truth has a way of making itself known often, when you least expect it. Have you ever had to hide your own success or passion because you knew the people around you just wouldn't understand? I would love to read your story in the comments below. Your experiences are what make this community so incredible. And if this story of silent strength and ultimate vindication resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories just like this one. Thank you for listening. And remember, be proud of the battles you fight in secret. They are the ones that define who you truly are.